Hello Star Wars fans, and welcome to another ranking video. Today I will be ranking all of the Star Wars EU books from the Bantam era. In case you are unaware, the Bantam era ran from 1991 to 1999 and includes all of the books published by Bantam Spectra during that time. I'm really excited to talk more about these books and rank them, especially because this is a video that I don't think has ever actually been made, as far as I could tell. Before we begin, I'd like to issue a spoiler warning, as well as a trigger warning. Some of my opinions are very unpopular and may be triggering to some people. Anyways, let's rank and review. At number 45, in last place, we have Children of the Jedi by Barbara Hambly, the first book in the unofficial Callista trilogy. And where do I even begin? This book is flawed in just about every possible way. The plot is nonsensical, hard to follow, and it's super contrived. The writing is so dull and boring, and the book is so long, so it's such a slog to get through. And of course, this is the book that is infamous for featuring a dream sex scene between Luke and a computer ghost Jedi. It's weird, and it's gross, and just so poorly written, and it lands in last place. At number 44 is Barbara Hambly's other Star Wars novel, Planet of Twilight. And while it's so much better than Children of the Jedi, it's still extremely dull, poorly written, and very forgettable. I will say I did enjoy how weird this book got. Not Jedi computer sex dreams weird. This time we've got beetles and viruses and a Jedi hut and a beetle that has evolved into a humanoid. It's also much shorter than Children of the Jedi, which instantly makes it more tolerable. At number 43 is Slave Ship by K.W. Jeter, the second book of the Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy. What puts this book so low is that it is shockingly uneventful. Almost absolutely nothing happens in this book. There's a flashback storyline about Bosk and Boba Fett going after a bounty that doesn't get resolved until the next book, and the present-day storyline literally consists of Boba, Dengar, and Neela traveling through hyperspace to a place they don't reach, you guessed it, until the next book. It is actually unbelievable how little happens in this book. At number 42 is Hard Merchandise by K.W. Jeter, the third book of the same trilogy. Luckily, some stuff actually happens in this book. We get the resolution to the flashback storyline. We get the destruction of the Kuat drive yards. We get the death of Kudar Mubat. But unfortunately, none of it held any substance. This book, like most of the trilogy, just felt very empty. It felt inconsequential and boring, not to mention how poor the writing was. Next, at number 41, we've got the third book of the Jedi Academy trilogy, Champions of the Force by Kevin J. Anderson. And this marks a pretty decent leap in quality. This one has some fun moments, specifically the whole conclusion to the Exar Kun plotline. However, this book's biggest weakness is that plotline is dropped in like the first third of the book, and pretty much the rest of the book features the Ma installation plotline, which was just so boring. At number 40, we have X-Wing Book 8, Isard's Revenge. This book, as well as being boring and forgettable, literally does not have to exist. It does not justify its own existence at all. The book brings back Isard, does absolutely nothing with her, and then just kills her off again. The book brings back Rogue Squadron back into the forefront and does nothing with them. There's no character development at all. The only substantial part of this book is the rescue of the Lusankia prisoners, which could have very easily been tied up in a separate story. At number 39, we've got Shield of Lies by Michael P. QB McDowell, the second book of the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy. And this book, unlike the others in the trilogy, is structured so strangely. Instead of jumping back and forth between the three main subplots like a normal book, this one is split up into three distinct chunks, which not only ruined the pacing, but it also means that if you're not invested in any one of these storylines, you are going to be stuck with it nonstop for an entire third of the book. Now, besides the really weird structure of the book, it's also just a very forgettable book in a very forgettable trilogy. At number 38, we've got the third book in the trilogy, Tyrant's Test. Now, while this book is structured like a normal book, I found that by the time I reached this book, I was just so ready to be done with the trilogy, so this one just slogged while I was reading it, and it was so forgettable. Perhaps that isn't fair to this particular book, as since I'm letting the other books affect my opinion of it, but I'd be lying if I said my experience with this book was a enjoyable one. At number 37, we actually have Light Cider by Tom Veitch. Now, technically, this isn't a true Bantam era book. It's a novella. It's technically non-canon since it got canceled and was only released unofficially, I think, last year. But either way, I wanted the list to be a clean 45, so it's here anyway. Overall, I just didn't enjoy Tom Veitch's writing style at all. He's definitely a better comic writer. His prose was just sloppy and amateurish, and really bogged down what was a decent story overall. Then at number 36 is possibly the first big controversial placement of this list, and that is X-Wing Book 2, Wedge's Gamble by Michael Stackpole. It's really unfortunate because this book had the potential to be something so special and fun. The infiltration of Coruscant was really fun at first, but the book dragged it out for so long. There are like 250 pages of the same thing. Rogue Squadron sabotaging a warehouse, then a power grid or something, then a satellite. Not to mention, some of the writing in this section of this book was really bad. For example, there's a part of the book where Corran is in a speeder chase, and one of his pursuers crashes into an apartment building, and of all the apartments in Coruscant, it just so happens to be the one apartment where Wedge and everybody else is. I don't know, that's just some Barbara Hambly levels of contrived. Then there's the end of the book where the big battle of Coruscant that's been set up for 2 whole books is like 2 pages long. So overall, the book is not horrible, but it had so much potential to be better. Next, at number 35 is Dark Apprentice by Kevin J. Anderson, the second book in the Jedi Academy trilogy. This book is very representative of my issues with Kevin J. Anderson and this trilogy as a whole. Narratively, I enjoyed it, and I think there's so many great ideas here, but from a writing perspective, it's simply not a very good book. There are 2 major issues I had with this book. The first is that there's so many plot lines that go absolutely nowhere. Secondly, and this is a pretty big one, all of the characters are so incompetent. Whether it's the heroes making idiotic decisions, or the villains acting incompetent just to drag the plot out, the character writing was just not good at all. Then we have number 34, which is Assault at Salonia, the second book of the Corellian trilogy by Roger McBride Allen. And again, this book is representative of my issues with the Corellian trilogy as a whole, mainly my one big issue with this trilogy, which is that it should have been 1 or 2 books. The 3 books of this trilogy blend together, not too much happens, and it's all dragged on for too long. On its own, I enjoyed this book, but with it being the middle book of a trilogy with an already slim narrative, it's just unremarkable. However, this book did bring back characters and elements from Truce of Bakura, which I really liked. It's also the book where Han Solo fist fights an otter, which is the greatest sentence ever spoke. Now at number 33, we have The Crystal Star by Vonda N. McIntyre, generally considered to be the worst Star Wars book of all time. As you can already tell, I disagree. It's no masterpiece, however, I will defend this book whenever I'm given the chance, because it is by no means the worst Star Wars book, and in my opinion, it can hardly be considered a bad book. Honestly, my only major issues with this book is that it can get boring and slow, and it's a bit too long. Other than that, I think all the criticism it receives is unfair. This is pretty much classic Bantam era. Some weird characterization, some boring subplots, some forgettable characters, and some weird sci-fi stuff. But it's the first book to actually flesh out the Solo children. It's also got Waru, which, enough said. At number 32, we have Tales from Jabba's Palace, a short story collection about the various patrons of Jabba's Palace, obviously. And personally, I just found the setting of Jabba's Palace exhausting after a while. There are like dozens of stories, and of course, a majority of them take place in the palace, and it just got really repetitive and bland. I did appreciate the larger murder mystery story that was being told. That was a really nice touch and added a very necessary through line to all these stories. But for me, this collection just got a bit tiring. Next, at number 31, we've got Showdown at Centerpoint by Roger McBride Allen, the third book in the Corellian trilogy. One thing I said in my review, and I'll say it here, this is the book where things finally start happening. The first two books do a lot of setup, they pose a lot of questions, and this is where we finally start getting some answers and seeing some payoff. The only problem with this book, as with the whole trilogy, is that it just gets kind of bland, whether it be the characters, the plot, or the writing in general. Nothing from this book or trilogy truly stand out as memorable in the long run. At number 30, we've got the first book of the Corellian trilogy, Ambush at Corellia, and what puts this book above the others in the trilogy was the first third, which was surprisingly really well written. There was a lot of really great scenes with some great character development and character interactions, and then the book got a bit slow and bland, and the rest of the trilogy never really recovered, but the beginning here made the book a really enjoyable read. Then at number 29, we have Tales of the Bounty Hunters. There were a few stories I really enjoyed from this, specifically Boba Fett's and then Zuckuss and Forlom's story. Other than that, however, IG-88's was really weird, Dengar's was pretty forgettable, and Bosk's was just not very good. So overall, it's a pretty fun idea, but the execution just wasn't great. At number 28, we have Darksaber by Kevin J. Anderson. Darksaber is usually considered one of the weaker books in the EU, however, I enjoyed it. For the most part, it's just not great. The writing and the storylines are pretty silly, but the book is a great highlight reel. There are a handful of memorable moments in this book, including the murder of the Imperial warlords, the sacrifice of Dorsk 81, the death of Crix Maydeen, and many more. So while the book as a whole is heavily flawed, it's got some great moments that helped it get this high on the list. Next, at number 27 and 26, we have Tales from the New Republic and Tales from the Empire, respectively. These two books are very hard to actually review and form an opinion on, because unlike the rest of the Tales books, they lack that narrative through line. So these are just truly short story collections. However, I enjoyed the almost ground-level perspective that these stories gave us. Because these stories were tabletop RPG tie-ins, the characters that we followed weren't big-name Jedi or galactic emperors. These were just your everyday smugglers, gamblers, Imperials, or whatever. So these stories kind of just felt like the authors were having fun playing in that Star Wars sandbox, and I really enjoyed that. Of these two, I'd say I enjoyed Tales from the Empire more. I simply preferred the selection of stories there. At number 25, we've got X-Wing Book 4, The Back to War by Michael Stackpole. Usually I see this book get ranked much higher by people, however, I simply found this one a bit forgettable. I didn't find all of the Booster Tarek and Talon card stuff interesting at all, and I just found it to be a pretty forgettable conclusion to the Rogue Squadron arc. However, I did really enjoy the smaller scale of this book, with the squadron resigning and going rogue, no pun intended, to stop Isard and free Thyfera. I really enjoyed that smaller, mostly personal scale for this finale. Next, at number 24, is Before the Storm by Michael P. QB McDowell, the first book in the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy, and a very underrated book. This is one of the most unique Star Wars books I've read, since it doesn't really feel like Star Wars. It's got a lot more focus on the military sci-fi aspects of Star Wars, which makes it almost feel more like Halo or something, and I really enjoyed that aspect and thought it was pretty refreshing. I also really enjoyed the Yvetha in this book, specifically Neil Spar. He was a very interesting villain. We also, of course, had the Lando and Lobot plotline start here, and I think that it was at its most enjoyable in this book. The Luke plotline wasn't too bland yet as well. Overall, other than Leia's absolutely horrendous characterization, this was a pretty enjoyable book. At number 23, we have Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, which, of course, follows a bunch of background characters and patrons from the Cantina, and this was easily my favorite Tales book. I enjoyed the overarching story behind being told, and I really enjoyed a lot of these stories. Greedos, the Stormtroopers, the Bartenders, the Wolfmans, Bosheks, the Moisture Farmers, there were just so many good ones here. At number 22, we have Heart of the Jedi by Kenneth C. Flint. Again, I'm kind of cheating by including this since it was canceled and only ever released unofficially. However, since I read and reviewed and, as you can tell, really enjoyed it, I thought I'd include it nonetheless. Overall, this book had some boring subplots and forgettable side characters, but it also had a lot of fun aspects. I really enjoyed Luke's plotline. We see him return to Tatooine. He meets a really great character named Captain Thatch. I also really loved C-3PO. He gets reprogrammed by Imperials and acts all sassy towards Han and even eventually attacks him. But again, this one was just a bit forgettable. There's also a plot twist here that I really hated, which I won't spoil, but I talked about it in my review. But overall, it's a pretty fun book. At number 21, we've got Shadows of the Empire by Steve Perry. Now, I have not read the junior novelization, I have not played the game, so to me, Shadows of the Empire is a novel and some comics, and not a huge overhyped multimedia project. So as just a novel, I really enjoyed it. First off, I really enjoy the time period between episodes 5 and 6, and I thought this book did a good job of connecting those films. I also really enjoyed the new characters, specifically Prince Shizor and Dash Rendar, and overall it definitely feels like it could almost be a Star Wars episode 5.5. It feels very grand and cinematic, and it's just very fun, classic Star Wars. Then at number 20, we've got X-Wing Book 7 Solo Command by Aaron Alston. Usually this is another book that gets a lot more love than I think it deserves. I enjoyed the book, I thought it was very good, however it wasn't the greatest thing ever written. I enjoyed the character development for Min and Lara, and I enjoyed the classic X-Wing stuff, the pilots, the space battles, etc. But what really held this book back for me was actually the courtship of Princess Leia and the knowledge that Zinj and the Iron Fist would escape, especially since this whole book was pretty much a giant witch hunt to finally capture Zinj. So when he slips through their fingers at the end, it's just anticlimactic. At number 19, we have Jedi Search by Kevin J. Anderson, and this was just a delightful book to read. I really enjoyed all of the plot lines. Seeing Luke travel the galaxy looking for potential Jedi was great. Everything with Han and Chewie on Kessel was great. My only complaints is, first, the completely unnecessary 30-page chapter about Lando and the Blob races, and then the fact that this book feels almost like a prologue to the trilogy. There's this book, which sets everything up, and then the next two pay it all off. But maybe distancing itself from Dark Apprentice and Champions of the Force was what was best for this book, since it completely beat those two out on this ranking. At number 18 is I, Jedi by Michael Stackpole, possibly the most overrated book on this list. I simply do not understand the amount of love this book gets from so many people who say that it is one of the best, if not the best, Star Wars book of all time. It's fun, I enjoyed it, but it has some glaring issues. Mainly, it feels so disrespectful toward the Jedi Academy books, with it forcing Corran into the story and making it all about him. I did enjoy the second half of this book when Corran goes to Calcris to infiltrate the pirates, but other than being a fun book, it's nothing too special, so although I enjoyed it, it's still extremely overrated. Next, at number 17, we have Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn. Usually the consensus is that this is the better of the two Hand of Thrawn books, but I found this book a bit sloppy and way too long. There were a few plotlines here that could have been cut entirely, and it would have made the book much better. But the plotlines I enjoyed, I really did enjoy. Luke and Mara finally got together in this book, and it was so satisfying to see. We also got to meet George Cardass, who I absolutely loved. I thought learning about his experiences, meeting a Jedi and whatnot, was super interesting. And of course, this book features the end of the Galactic Civil War, with Paleon and Gaversum signing the peace treaty. So overall, I thought this book was very good, and despite its flaws, it served as a really good conclusion to the Bantam era storyline. Then at number 16, we have X-Wing Book 3, The Krytos Trap by Michael Stackpole, and this is probably the most underrated of the X-Wing series. It's usually considered to be the weakest of the Rogue Squadron quadrilogy, and I can certainly see why. There's very little action for most of the book. It's very slow, some could say even meandering, and I kind of agree, but the book's conclusion single-handedly saved this book. From the Lusankya crashing, breaking free from under Coruscant, to the dramatic conclusion of Tycho's trial, to the rogues going rogue and resigning from the New Republic, the ending to this book was just so thrilling and epic and satisfying. Next at number 15 is The Courtship of Princess Leia by Dave Wolverton, a very controversial book for a few reasons, mainly due to the fact that Han literally mind controls and kidnaps Leia. Yeah, that's not one of the strongest scenes from the book, that's for sure. And that whole first, third of the book was pretty bad. From the boring politics to the dreadful love triangle, it just didn't work. But once they get to Dathomir, the book becomes a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the pulpy, cheesy fantasy tone of this book. It's very unique to Star Wars, and it was so much fun. Dathomir is a cool planet. We learn about the Hapens and the Night Sisters and the Rancors, and we get some decent villains with Zinj and Geth Zirian, and Luke does some pretty cool Force stuff in the book, so overall, it ended up being pretty enjoyable. Next, at number 14 is The Mandalorian Armor by K.W. Jeter. You weren't expecting to see this book crawl its way this high on the list, were you? Well, I don't know what to say. I just really enjoyed this book. The present-day storyline with Dengar and Neela saving an injured Boba Fett, it's something I've wanted to see since I first saw Return of the Jedi, and it was just so much fun. And when Boba finally woke up, it was so badass and satisfying. And the flashback storyline featured a really fun mission. I loved this book, and if you remember, the other two of this trilogy were near the bottom of this list, so it goes without saying that this was the best of the trilogy. At number 13, we have The New Rebellion, possibly the most underrated book on this list. The New Rebellion is greatly considered to be one of the weakest Star Wars books. It's probably the one that people talk about the least as well. So going into this book, I was not expecting much. But for some reason, every single plotline in this book was so interesting and enthralling to me. I enjoyed the Senate bombing plotline. I found it really visceral. I loved the Nandreessen stuff with Han and Lando. I loved Kueller and Brackus. I just enjoyed everything about this book, right up until the end. The final act of this book was very rushed, and it definitely dragged the book down, but the rest of it was just great. Next, at number 12, we've got The Truce at Bakura by Kathy Tyers, a very solid book. I love that this book takes place mere hours after Return of the Jedi, and they do a lot of really fun stuff with that as well. I really enjoyed the unorthodox story being told here. You'd think that they'd want to tell an Imperial versus Rebel story right after the fall of the Empire, but instead, we get dinosaurs with ping-pong paddle guns that suck your soul out and turn you into a machine. It's really weird, it's really creepy, and I really enjoyed it all. At number 11 is The Hutt Gambit by A.C. Crispin, the second book in her brilliant Han Solo trilogy. This book covers a lot of Han's smuggler years, and it does such a fantastic job of sewing so much continuity together. A.C. Crispin threw in so many characters from the Bantam era books, even from the Marvel and Dark Horse comics and the Brian Daley trilogy. We also witnessed Han's first meetings with Lando, Boba Fett, even Jabba. While I do think it's the weakest of the trilogy, as you can see, it's still a damn good book. Kicking off our top 10 is Spectre of the Past by Timothy Zahn, the first book in the Hand of Thrawn duology. And I know what you're thinking, this book is mostly just set up for the Vision of the Future, and yet I've ranked it significantly higher. Like I said, Vision of the Future was very long and dense, whereas this book did a great job of setting up the duology while still feeling consequential. I really enjoyed Paleon's attempts to negotiate with the New Republic. I enjoyed the mystery behind the Chiss ships. I enjoyed the growing tensions around the Kamas documents. If I'm going to be honest, I think this book set up a more interesting second book than what we got with Vision of the Future. And again, I don't dislike book 2. I just think it needed a few more drafts. At number 9 is X-Wing Book 5, Wraith Squadron by Aaron Alston. After winning everybody over with the Rogue Squadron books, shifting focus to a completely new group of pilots was such a risky move, and it paid off beautifully. This book is such a fun introduction to these characters. It's such a different vibe from the Rogues, but it works so well. I also really enjoyed Aaron Alston's writing for the space battles, specifically for the battles of Folor and Ession, which had some really creative strategies employed by the Rebels. Honestly, the only thing holding this book back was that it was a bit too long, and the Nightcaller plotline got a bit too repetitive. Next in number 8 is X-Wing Book 1 Rogue Squadron by Michael Stackpole, an absolutely phenomenal introduction to the series. It probably has the best, pilot dynamic in terms of the whole group interacting in the barracks, or the hangar bay, or the briefing room, or whatever. It also had some fantastic battles, with the raid on Talassia being a memorable one, as well as the first and second battles of Borlaeus. The only issue I really have with this book is that Corrin just wasn't very relatable or likable to me as a protagonist, but since then I've come around on him a lot. At number 7, we have X-Wing Book 9, Starfighters of Adumar by Aaron Alston, probably the funniest book in the EU I've read thus far. This book was just such a joy to read. I think it's one of the only books I've actually read in a single sitting. It was just a blast. The characters were hilarious, the plot was very self-contained and very fast-paced, and I just really enjoyed myself while reading this one. And at number 6, we have Dark Force Rising, Book 2 of Timothy Zahn's phenomenal and iconic Thrawn trilogy, and this book is just fantastic. The only reason this book is my least favorite in the trilogy is simply because the other two books have more going on. This is very much a middle book in that it furthers the plot quite a bit, and it sets up the third book, but it doesn't have as many memorable or impactful moments as the first and third books do. This one, however, is so well written. The plot has layers upon layers, and it's sometimes complicated to read, but very rewardingly so. I also absolutely love the side plots in this book, whether it's the hunt for the Katana fleet, Luke's trip to Jomark, and especially Leia and Chewie's time on Honoghr, one of my favorite plot lines from any book I've read so far. Just making it into our top 5 is Rebel Dream by A.C. Crispin, the final book in her trilogy, and this book is simply phenomenal. Firstly, we have even more continuity here. We've got Han winning the Falcon, and we also get to see his famous Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. However, what really made this book special was that everything with Bria. Her bringing Han into the Alliance only to betray him was such a shocking and tragic turn of events. It ruined their relationship, it ruined Han and Lando's friendship, and it also soured Han on the rebellion for a while. And then, one of my favorite moments in the entire EU is when the book ends in the Mos Eisley Cantina, and Han first lays eyes on Obi-Wan and Luke. His life is about to change forever. I don't think I've ever been so moved by the end of a book in my life. At number 4, we've got Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn. This book is just pure cinema. The energy that Zahn was able to capture from the movies made this book so fun and breezy to read. The plot was well written, refreshing, and the characters were iconic. Even ignoring his brilliant job at capturing the essence of the film characters, the cast of original characters that Timothy Zahn was able to create, I have no words. Grand Admiral Thrawn and Mara Jade are two of the most iconic characters to ever come out of a supplementary novel. And then there's Pelion, Talon Card, Jorah Sabaoth, the list goes on. This is another book that I read in a single sitting, and it was just so riveting from beginning to end. Kicking off our top 3 is The Last Command by Timothy Zahn, and this book is my favorite of the trilogy simply because of how satisfying it is as a conclusion. The way it was able to tie everything up in a nice little bow made it so fun to read. Mara's redemption, Rook betraying Thrawn, the birth of the Solo twins, the creation of the Smugglers' Alliance, it all just fit together like a really satisfying puzzle. That's the one word that always pops into my head when I think of this book. Satisfying. Our runner-up at number 2 is X-Wing Book 6, Iron Fist by Aaron Alston. A beautiful book. First of all, the cover is immaculate. It's beautiful. The book itself is possibly even better. I loved all of the espionage and the disguises and the sabotage. The character death in this book is a gut punch. It's real, it's visceral, and it still has stuck with me over a year later. The section with Castan Dawn sneaking about the Iron Fist, for some reason, is one of the most thrilling chapters of any Star Wars book I've ever read. This book is just brilliant. And at number 1, my favorite Bantam-era Star Wars novel is The Paradise Snare by A.C. Crispin. Another book I read in a single sitting because it was just so riveting. Following Han from his childhood to his teen years to adulthood, seeing him fall in love, seeing that love shatter, him getting his revenge on Garrus Shrike, him escaping that heartbreak by running to the Imperial Academy. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the raw humanity of this book, but I was just so enthralled in Han's life. Usually I prefer a book that has a good balance of plot and character, but this was just Han drifting from day to day, and I was just along for the ride. It was so entertaining, especially as a huge Han Solo fan. Anyways, that is my list. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Comment down below what was your favorite or least favorite Bantam era books. And stay tuned for my future videos. We, of course, have some big reviews coming up, as well as a few more ranking videos that I want to make. See ya.